stop before we fall asleep. But it goes on like that for 17 minutes, just so you know. Another example is, this is from his On Land record, that he did in collaboration with Daniel Lanois, a name some of you might know. Again, this sort of music seems quite commonplace now, but when it came out in the late 70s, it was quite radical. I mean, no one had really heard anything like this. Ambient music is ultimately about texture, how sound can be organized vertically, how things are layered, but in a very subtle way. It is music where melody and rhythm, the two main pillars of rock and pop music, have a much reduced role. In Eno's ambient compositions, time can seem to stand still. It seems frozen. There's little or no melodic development. Nothing that you can hum or sing along to. It's actually, and he uses these words himself, a geographic music. It doesn't bring so much to mind pictures of landscapes. Instead, when you enter it, he wants you to enter inside a landscape, like you're entering a world in and of itself. But while Eno never had any commercial success with his ambient records, people were listening. In 1983, Eno received a call from the drummer of a fast-rising rock band called U2. They wanted Eno to produce their next album and to lead them into fresh sonic territory. Eno had already had success bringing his more avant-garde ideas to a rock audience and pop audience with his work with the Talking Heads, which I'll get to in just a second. At first, he said absolutely no to U2. He hated Bono, actually. He thought Bono was a complete idiot and sang horribly, and he didn't understand like why this band was coming to him, because he was doing this very quiet music, and there was this really pompous guy singing over the top of it. Today, obviously, they're very good friends, but at the time, it wasn't really working out. Eventually, Eno did say yes, and at first, they made an album called Unforgettable Fire, which actually was not really, let's say, the breakthrough album for U2, but it kind of set them going. This is in some place in Dublin. 2 years later, though, they collaborated on this album, Joshua Tree. And here it's very clear how Eno's ambient experimentation was working in terms of U2's music and pop music in general. We'll just listen to it a little bit. This is from Where the Streets Have No Name. It's a lot like what we were listening to before, but it doesn't go on for 17 minutes. Stop before Bono comes in. As I said, Eno had already collaborated with another up-and-coming rock band, and that was the Talking Heads. Eno and the Heads worked together first on an album called Fear of Music, and during that time, Eno and the band's leader, David Byrne, developed a deep passion for African music, especially the music by a Nigerian singer-songwriter, bandleader named Fela Kuti. This is David Byrne and Brian Eno. Eno and Byrne entered the studio in 1979, without much plan, but except to investigate these new rhythmic and textural ideas that they had fallen in love with. I'll read just a little bit about that album very briefly. Let's see. They created an album called My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. It was recorded in 1979, just prior to the sessions of the Talking Heads record Remain in Light. The title is borrowed from a metaphorical book by the Nigerian novelist Amos Tutola about a young man who ventures beyond the confines of his village into the mysterious unknown bush country. Both Eno and Byrne had for a number of years been interested in non-Western musical styles, particularly those of sub-Saharan Africa and the Arabic cultural world. The Talking Heads Eno records, such influences function implicitly, but on My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, they became explicit. Eno's ambitions were high. He wanted to make fourth world music. Music that was done in sympathy with and in consciousness of music of the rest of the world, rather than just Western or European or just rock music. An example of this is the following song. This album is a seminal one, not only for the revolutionary incorporation of African rhythms to rock music, but also because it's one of the first examples of samples. And this was not done with a sampler. This is before samplers existed. So they're basically flying in these voices of this preacher from one tape deck onto another. Again, it's trial and error. Again, it's easy to get it wrong. You know, obviously it's, you know, it didn't always work out, but it's an entire record made out of these really complex pieces done completely in analog. The next year they got together and they made a record with the Talking Heads, who at that time was already a fairly popular group, and you can hear how they're incorporating these experimental ideas. Now, this is more a pop record, but it's all right there. So why are we talking about Brian Eno? I think what we can learn from Brian Eno is a lot, actually. I think the implications of his music are very rich, and they're very hard to reduce into just a few points, but I will try anyway. Number one, be open to chance. I think it's absolutely fundamental. In the studio, in your songs, in your performances, the wrong ideas, I'm sure we've all had this experience, the wrong ideas are often the best ones. Your mistakes can easily become your most important idea if you're open to what is happening. There is no right and wrong, there's only what works and what doesn't. And your job as the producer is obviously to figure that out, to figure out what works. But you know, nothing innovative ever happens by just doing it by the book, by just doing it the right way. So one way to get out of the normal patterns of doing things is chance, just to trust the moment. The second thing is about texture. Texture is just as compelling as melody or rhythm. The sounds and the characteristics of instruments you choose can be just as important as the song itself. How we vertically organized sound can be very compelling. Be open to new ideas in this regard. Don't get locked in preconceived ideas about what genres require or what certain types of bands should sound like. I mean, U2 is a great example. U2 at this point more or less was a stadium, not a particularly interesting rock band until Eno came along. And then suddenly this experimentation with different sounds, sounds that were not in the normal, let's say, rock choice of sounds, suddenly moved them into another place. And actually, ironically, it was both a more experimental place and a much more commercially successful place, because suddenly they didn't sound like everybody else. They sounded like something different. You know, sounds have their own beauty. Sometimes they need to be a central part of the stories we're telling. Sometimes they need space to breathe and should just be left alone. Sometimes we don't need to have so much music. We sometimes just need more sound, you know. Third point is be open to other cultures. Our musical frames of references are not the only one. Eno and Byrne went deep into African traditions, but came out with something that was not African, but it was still very compelling. They were borrowing freely, they were stealing really, but they didn't try to do African music. They tried to put it also into their world. And the fourth thing, again, for us that do electronic music, this is not a radical point, but the studio can be a place to create, not just to document. Electronic producers already know this, but many of us rock musicians easily forget this. There's nothing pure to begin with, so forget about purity. Seek excitement and depth of feeling as opposed to conforming to the way things have been done before. We love certain types of music, but we should not be too in love with certain types of music, too reverent. We should find space for ourselves and our own expression inside the music that we create. The studio is potentially a free space where this can happen, just as long as we don't start closing doors before we even enter them.